So I'd like to start by introducing our moderator, Ms. Nancy Colleton. She's the president of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. And Nancy will be both moderating the panel discussion and also the audience and question and answer session. So we will make sure that we leave time for you to ask your questions. Moving on to our speakers, I'd like to briefly introduce each of the panelists that we have today. So starting with Ms. Tahara Dawkins, she is the Chief of Staff for the National Space Council at the White House. Mr. David Gauthier, Director of the Commercial and Business Operations Group at the National Geospatial Agency, the NGA. And Dr. Ed Kearns, who is the Chief Data Officer at First Street Foundation and was the former Chief Data Officer at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Department of Commerce. So welcome to you, all our panelists. So in order to maximize the time today, what we're going to do is put a link to each of the bios for each of our very distinguished panelists and also to Nancy in the chat. And with that, I'd like to pass the proceedings over to Nancy to kick off our discussion. So with that, thank you, Nancy.
Great. And thank you, Sally. And I hope that one day we can meet in person soon.
Me as well.
That would be awesome. And a special thank you to Courtney Stad for having the idea for this webinar, and also my good friend Bill Klenke, and also IGS board member Bill Klenke, for helping facilitate this discussion today with giving me some really great background. It's a really difficult time right now that we've lived through, whether it's rising issues with air pollution, wildfires, and other changes that are taking place on the planet. But you know, we really have arrived at a significant point of time where the investment in U.S. Earth observations is really starting to be maximized, not only for the U.S. government, but outside the government. And this is a really great thing because we are faced with some really great challenges. Think about it. Since NOAA started monitoring billion-dollar weather and climate events, it's exceeded $2 trillion. Add to that 135 million Americans breathe unhealthy or polluted air. It's estimated that it costs the United States about $820 billion a year in premature deaths and also health issues related to heart attacks and strokes. We have a wildfire season that has become more lengthy, and the fire days within that season are becoming more numerous. And then in addition, the UN just put out a report where they have discussed that we might lose more than 1 million species in coming decades. So the idea of biodiversity loss as a national security is beginning to be recognized as a priority. You add to all of those things, and there are many more things to add, of course, but we have a Russian invasion of Ukraine that is a continuing war where we have a humanitarian as well as an environmental catastrophes. You have the US Department of Defense that is trying to reposition programs and activities to deal with the changing climate, whether it's how we train and where we train our troops, how we operate in the Arctic, and how we might better preserve and protect our properties, whether it be air bases on coastal regions or elsewhere. So with all of these things, and to make decisions about how we move forward in protecting and moving on to the future, we need information. And that's what this panel is all about today, very simply. I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Gauthier, Ms. Dawkins, and Dr. Kearns, who will help us navigate what's happening in the area of environmental intelligence and what are some of the priorities, not just within the federal government, but within the private sector. And I'd like to start our discussion today with you, David, if you don't mind, and ask you about your role at NGA in dealing with environmental intelligence, how you might see that changing, and what are some of the challenges that you see ahead. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nancy. Also, thanks for having me on this panel. It's a fantastic opportunity. Those who know me well might know that I'm passionate about two things. One is new space technologies, but another is our global environment and everything we can learn from observing it. So this is fantastic. At NGA, I run commercial and business operations, and I see firsthand every day how our commercial remote sensing capabilities and commercial technologies can shine a spotlight on environmental and geopolitical issues every day around the world. And so, we have missions for commercial remote sensing that include just the ability to share information with our partners and allies around the world, countering malign influence from bad actors, highlighting environmental security issues, humanitarian aid and disaster relief, and also newer missions like countering illegal, unregulated, and unreported activities like illegal fishing around the world when we can find that. So at our office, we ensure that the US government has the best knowledge of what commercial solutions are available to them to meet various mission needs, but also access to commercial capabilities. And so we do market research with hundreds of companies every year, reviewing their products for quality and capabilities. And then we buy data from, at least 200 different satellites in the remote sensing arena, and then analytic services, which is information provided from that data from companies as well. And so some of the things we do for the environmental issues would be humanitarian aid, disaster relief. I already mentioned the ability to get rapid information into the hands of relief workers who are looking at rebuilding after earthquakes or tsunamis or floods, saving lives in terms of moving people in front of wildfires and floods as well. And then another issue that's growing for our community is climate security. And so I highlight on the background behind me a couple of global digital elevation model projects that have been given away to the public and were created in concert with several academic partners and societies. But we have a whole digital elevation model of the Arctic and also an elevation model of Antarctica. So what those have highlighted at great relief is how the watersheds act, what the different elevation tells us about those environments, and how those can open up to new science and new abilities to protect them. So a lot of commercial remote sensing for the environment. And I think I'll end with, because you mentioned Ukraine, we're actually providing an inordinate amount of commercial remote sensing data to the folks who are providing relief and help and assistance to Ukraine, including the Ukrainians themselves, with a great amount of electro-optical imagery every day, but also now radar imaging and other things that are helping them understand damage assessments and where their infrastructure needs help in terms of the electrical grid, roads, bridges, et cetera, in order to continue operating as a country.
Great. Well, thank you, David. And we'll probably come back and maybe ask you a follow-up question about radar and the electro-optical companies, some of them that you're working with and the data. But you also mentioned climate security. How much has climate security changed how NGA is working right now? And the thought of realigning programs and activities for climate security?
Yes, so we have realigned some budget and personnel resources to stand up climate security teams and purchase some data from the commercial market in order to feed that information directly to these teams looking at these issues. Some of this is new navigable ways through the Arctic. Some of it is what we anticipate in terms of trends when it comes to soil moisture, droughts. Droughts often lead to migrations of people, which then lead to crisis and uprisings in cities, which then lead to other problems over and over and over, even regime change. So we recognize that climate security is at the front end of an awful lot of third, fourth, fifth order effects that are important to our national security every day.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. That's a wonderful segue into moving over to Tahara. As the Space Council's first meeting last December with the Vice President Harris as chair, the new framework was the Space priorities framework was delivered. And it had in there a special statement on the United States will advance in the development and use of space-based Earth observation capabilities that support action on climate change. So building on what David just said about climate security, how much is climate change really helping to establish your agenda at the National Space Council, and how is the Space Council responding to this priority? What can we expect?
Thank you, Nancy. I think the first step may be recognition of public-private contributions and being aware of what each sector has to offer. It's definitely a changing landscape. The U.S. EO satellite community is evolving so rapidly, and the applications of U.S. government data is key to helping U.S. businesses and citizens navigate climate change. Therefore, the future requires a robust architecture that focuses on public and private contributions, an environment that promotes entrepreneurial solutions, new businesses and governance process that promote better efficiency, a future workforce that is strong in its diversity and inclusiveness, as it is its technical superiority. The U.S. assets have been and will continue to be critical to guiding national and international climate policy, whether for science, mitigation, or resilience. I'd just like to add that the National Space Council's first meeting, Vice President Harris specifically addressed confronting climate change and the importance of looking at our space endeavors for the good of our home planet, to the benefits of its people, our nation, and all of humanity. This will be our priority and will drive the work that we do. In fact, just yesterday, Vice President Harris announced the White House Water Security Action Plan. This is a great example on how Earth observation can support the broader goals and priorities.
That is awesome. Thank you. Now, talking about climate and the application of all these observations and the data analytics that we need, it's wonderful to have Ed Kearns here today, because he's really someone who, as a former chief data officer for NOAA, for the Department of Commerce, and now in the private sector for a very successful endeavor with First Street Foundation. It's great that you are taking all of this knowledge, all of your experience, and really helping to deliver it to the American people so that we can better manage our lives and our properties through climate services. So Ed, could you tell us your story and what you're doing with all of this information and intelligence to help us better deal with climate?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Nancy. Yeah. So I'm a physical oceanographer by training. That's what I got my PhD in. I've done a lot of satellite work and a lot of climate work. And my last couple of years with the federal government, so I was with the federal government about 15 years. The last 3 or 4 were as a chief data officer role. And one of the things we were focused on at that time was just making the information available to industry, right, and to the public, right? And so just getting all these massive quantities of satellite data and Earth observations and climate models out to the cloud, out to some place where the information could be used. And but this, as we know, is a necessary but insufficient condition for actually using the data, right? So there needs to be an interpretive layer between this complex Earth observation data and climate models and actually using it. And so I decided to take my own advice and left federal service 2 years ago, came over to the private sector, to the nonprofit First Street. And that's exactly what we're doing. So yeah, we're trying to create actionable information based upon climate change that can help inform people's decisions at all scales. And so the kind of information chain, a value chain that we're trying to set up is, as you say, Nancy, we call it climate services. A good analog to point to is weather services, right? So weather services have been around for decades. People are used to having some layer of expertise between the complicated weather models or hurricane models, whatever, and the use of this data. And sometimes the government is playing that role of interpreting the information. Do I evacuate my home as a hurricane is coming closer? And sometimes it's private industry. A lot of times you have a weather app on your phone that's telling you whether you should carry an umbrella today, right? So it seems like a very simple thing, but it's a $10 billion industry between the government sources of open data and these weather services that are being provided right now. And so with climate services, this is what we see that's emerging in the marketplace right now, because people need to have some way of understanding these complex observations, these complex scientific concepts and climate models themselves, which are not easy to understand, and bring it down to some kind of actionable, consumable information so they can make informed decisions about their lives if they're individual, if it's a city or a county or a state, how to prepare for this coming climate change.
Yeah. So let me follow up on something with you. So as I said, you had a key role within commerce to help get data out the door. And now you're in the private sector applying this. Were there any surprises for you in that role? Like how hard it was to get data? How difficult? Were there any challenges to changing roles from the government to the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of surprises. Knowing that the data were available on the cloud, I knew how to get to them and how we could start to use them on the private sector side. One thing I didn't quite anticipate was going to be how much demand for these products we've created at First Street for flood and fire already. How much demand there is going to be back from the federal government, because all the basic data that's the foundation of our products that drive our open science models, they have all come from the federal government. And I expected some demand for these products going back into government, but the demand for these products going back into government has been enormous, and it's great. And that's I love to see that as a data wonk. Our donors that support First Street love to see this too, because their donations are going to provide data that can be used to maximal societal benefit if it goes back into the federal government. And we signed a number of data sharing agreements now where we are sending our products back into the federal government to the same agencies that produce the basic data that now we have transformed into this, I would say simpler, more consumable information product.
Now, are there going to be, are there mechanisms that exist to easily do that? Because my personal experience is it's kind of hard, It's not like there's satellite data buys, but there are not necessarily environmental intelligence data buys and things like that. So that is a challenge.
It is a challenge. There's a lot of legal challenges, a lot of IP challenges. The fact that we're a nonprofit makes us a little bit different from the rest of the public sector, or private sector world that's for profit. And the fact that what we're doing right now is we're making our information available for free to the public and to governments under a non-commercial license. But it's not open data, but there's a license on it that says you can use it for non-commercial uses. And then we are also selling commercial licenses to insurance companies, banks, other commercial groups that want to make use of this information for commercial use. And we're trying to take that revenue stream and have a sustainable activity where the value of our data products that are based on government open data, the value of them to the industry is paying for our ability to give them away to the public. So it's a little bit tricky there. And one of the trickiest things is trying to give something of value to the federal government is always involves a lot of lawyers and stuff. And so simple data buys have proven to be the easiest way of moving data quickly into the federal government. Yeah.
And I've got to say too, I mean, one of the observations that I've had is really, and David, I think you're really good, you're a wonderful example of this, and the work that you do is the change in attitude towards working with the private sector and helping to build those bridges with the private sector. I just had a discussion with the administrator of NOAA not too long ago, where he talked about he has already met with 100 companies during his short tenure with NOAA, and how he wants to be recognized as being open to working with the private sector. So that's a real change. Do you see more changes on the horizon like that, David, for NGA? And I guess I would come back to you, Tahara, about is that something that the Space Council might be looking at, is how to build those bridges? So first to David, and then we'll go to Tahara.
Yeah, that's the exciting part about this, I think, for all of us, is that so much activity and investment is happening in the private-public space that we can actually make better relationships and connections across government and industry. And if government's better at signaling what it's interested in terms of future needs, and industry is able to then invest in their own capital into delivering on those needs, we make great solutions happen down the road. So we partner with so many companies to both provide that demand signal out to industry, but also to evaluate, some of their products and services in a try before we buy kind of mentality, just so that we can help everyone understand and improve upon those products and services for maybe scalability and the ability to use them in our operating environments every day. So we work very closely with our industry partners to do that. And often, they're bringing capability to market for commercial revenue, and they're already working to these ends. And the extent that we can sort of match up to that is really useful.
Great. Tahara, now over to you. I mean, your experience, Tahara, has been with NOAA, with NGA, with the US Geo, and so many international partners. What do you see as the special interest, or not, that's not the right terminology, but what do you see as the true interest of the Biden administration in wanting to develop this better relationships with the private sector, or leverage the resources of the private sector based on what the government needs or has helped to develop?
Space-based EO is evolving at a rapid pace, as I mentioned before. And as you said, I've been involved in Earth observations for most of my career, and I've witnessed firsthand the evolution of space data, primarily for remote sensing and weather, to today's robust offerings of government and private sector imagery and environmental intelligence products for a variety of sectors. There are many ways that we can answer this question: open data, open science, public-private partnerships, systems architectures that can carry the U.S. into the future, new mechanisms to promote commercial solutions. A key element will be working to ensure the data gets to the people that need it, from intelligence analysts and war fighters to farmers and firefighters.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Tahara. Let me go back to this point of saying that we want to get this information to the people that need it. And so part of this is all predicated on the idea that the US has an open data policy that you had talked about earlier, Ed and Tahara, and all three of you. Is it enough to just have an open data policy? Should more be done to help people better navigate all of the data that the government has available? I mean, there's only one Ed Kearns. Every company cannot hire Ed Kearns, but should there be more done? Should open data policy be the beginning of a process or the end of a process? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's the beginning of the process, right? So the open data it starts to unlock the possibilities, right? So usually the data are collected by the government with specific requirements. Usually fills up a couple of books, right? And it's a very complex, acquisition process, particularly for the space-based systems, right? And they're collected for a particular reason. But there's a myriad of other applications of those data. And I think the USGS Landsat experience is like the poster child for what we could expect from this kind of thing, right? So Landsat has been so successful, not just for its primary mission, but for all this public sector and private sector work that has grown on top of that, right? So we know that the value of the data far exceeds just the reason it was created. But the open data policies, how far do they go, right? Because now when they go to the private sector is using open data and they start to add value. Well, in some cases, that value just goes one way and nobody has access to the data. It becomes proprietary. We're seeing that a lot now with climate services, as a lot of the fledgling companies that have been spun up that are doing this, they're being acquired by bigger companies, right? And that's because there's incredible value. And for these larger companies that are acquiring these small startups, they then take that data and that interpretation internally, that analysis internally, use it for their shareholders and to create profits. And so that's fine. We understand how that works. But there is also a need to make sure that same level of information is available to everybody. And some of us call it data democratization, however you want to call it. But there's a need for disseminating that information in a very accessible way. And I'll stop short of saying open, because there can be strings attached. Like I said, we're using non-commercial licenses in order to kind of walk this fine line between giving the data away for data democratization and also enabling us to find a way to keep the lights on at our small nonprofit to keep this going, right? So there is a value chain that we have to be respectful of, but if we're aware of it and we're not afraid of it, these kind of public-private partnerships between government and private sector can grow and can provide enormous use. As I mentioned before, that even goes back into the federal government, not just out to other companies and to the public.
Great. Speaking of data and imagery and new products, David, back to you. As somebody had asked me a question earlier about the NRO contracts that were recently awarded regarding electro-optical companies. And could we look forward to seeing more synthetic aperture radar kinds of products being made available through contracts with NGA, or what kinds of new products do you see on the horizon?
Yes, so the NRO purchases the imagery on behalf of the federal government. They last week did award new electro-optical or visible imagery contracts to, Maxar, Planet, and Black Sky. And so that does represent a significant step increase in the amount of imaging capacity that the US government can now afford, which we're thrilled about that. And a lot of that imagery is completely unclassified and shareable. So we are also in the process of setting up at NGA what we call an unclassified data lake. And that will be a place, where researchers and academics and other government interested agencies and federal civil partners can come in and actually access that data in bulk to drive algorithms and other solutions. So, but that's visible. So you mentioned SAR, or synthetic aperture radar imagery. We're very excited about this. There are about 10 US companies starting up SAR constellations. So there's huge investment in doing so. SAR has some great advantages in that it works day, night, all weather, and is inherently a measurement of the Earth and the environment. So it works very well if you're trying to take automated measurements, and you can do some repeatability in the geometry of things, the way you collect, to get very close and accurate measurements on the ground. So we've been experimenting with some of the new SAR providers for the past few months. And when the crisis in Ukraine really kicked off, we realized we had to get out of experimentation mode and roll very quickly into operational mode. Months ahead of schedule, we started pushing SAR imagery out to the user community, and it's been used in a number of derivative products to help highlight the situation going on in Ukraine and provide some actionable intelligence there.
Great. Well, thank you. Tahara, do you want to add anything to new companies or what you see on the horizon? Okay. Well, so what I'd like to do now is ask all of three of you a question that I think is near and dear to, it's a topic that I think is near and dear to all of your hearts. And, it's another priority within the Space Priorities Framework, where it's investing in the next generation. And this is certainly something that is of great interest to me, having a nonprofit that deals with education and helping to better develop a data literate public. We know that there's great demand for environmental intelligence and better data and information for decision making. But how do we develop that cadre of people or the workforce that we need to support what each of you does each and every day? As I said, there's only one Ed Kearns. We can't all hire you, but how do we address the workforce issue and the data literacy issue? And Tahara, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. And then I'd like to go back to both Ed and David to get your thoughts about, is this a topic you all worry about? And what can we do collectively to fix it? Tahara.
Yeah, so as you may have heard at the December Space Council meeting, STEM is a priority for our civil agencies, our commercial industry, and just as much for our national security. Access to and benefits of science and technology remain unequally distributed across racial, gender, economic, and geographic lines. We know that we need to provide opportunities and pathways from elementary school through college to include disadvantaged locations and populations. At the Space Council meeting, the Vice President presented a task of using space to inspire more students to be interested in STEM and identifying and reducing barriers to entering and staying in the workforce. To this extent, we at the National Space Council just recently onboarded a new council staff. That's the Director of Space STEM Policy, who in partnership with counterparts in the Office of Science and Technology Policy are working to try to find solutions for our industry and workforce. The work that we are doing will result in both a plan as well as tangible opportunities for the space sector and members of the National Space Council to implement. Finally, the VP also tasked the National Space Council with working to develop a modern day version of the National Defense Education Act. If that's implemented, this will be a once in a generation investment in building a well-trained STEM and skilled workforce.
Oh, that's great information. And so your new Director of Space STEM Policy, has that person been announced? I apologize for not knowing.
Yeah, she's been announced. Her name is Elaine Ho. She's from NASA. She's a NASA person. She was working for OSTP and now she's with us.
Excellent, excellent. Great information. David, over to you.
Yeah, we're definitely interested in the STEM pipeline and hooking kids early to become imagery analysts and geoint experts. The geospatial intelligence is about the physical understanding of the earth and how it changes every day. So I can imagine, school projects, citizen science projects, embracing academia, non-governmental organizations, charities, et cetera, and giving them access to new data that can help them measure, trend, and visualize the world in new ways. And so we've seen some of this with crowdsourcing campaigns, and there's wonderful platforms on the internet where you can sign up to crowdsource information about the world and look at satellite imagery and call out things that you see there. And that's actually valuable information. We have a project called GNOME, the NSG Open Mapping Enclave, that does exactly that. It launches crowdsourcing campaigns, and people look at commercial imagery and highlight features on the planet that then go into sort of these large maps that we curate for the world. So I think more and more of that is exciting to young people, especially if they can see that they're solving a problem that's in front of us every day.
Great. And Ed, how are you all at First Street thinking about this?
Yeah, so one of the things as we're trying to do is as we're creating our products and we're giving them to say like a local government or city government, and we're like, hey, great, here's your projections for the next 30 years for fire and flood for your community, so you can start to prepare. What we have found is there's not a lot of communities that have the technical resources on their side that can actually get busy with those data, and that was not a surprise to me, but it's even a larger obstacle than I thought. I knew it was going to be an obstacle, but it's even a greater obstacle. So we're continuing to make the data easy to use. The other piece of this is that it's also important to take it beyond just say like the physical risk. Is my house going to flood? Is my house going to burn down? Is City Hall going to be threatened? But taking it to that next level of tying economists and economic analysis into the physical risk, right? So this is taking it one step beyond what most like federal agencies usually do, one or the other. Having this combined analysis that can translate the information into what is it going to mean for businesses in the area, jobs, what is it going to mean for insurance rates and bond rates in these areas? It gets very complex very quickly, and having the analytical expertise set up to do this at multiple levels is really, really hard. So it may be a big opportunity for private industry to step into that void. But it's going to take a while to build this kind of capacity in this country.
Great. And I think it takes a village. But at any rate, let's what I'd like to do now is move over to some of the questions that have been coming up on our chat here. And I'd like to start with Courtney Stad. And Courtney, if you could come on to the
Sure.
And ask your question, and then we'll have I'll have Sally Frage on deck.
All righty. Well, thank you, Nancy. Been terrific discussion, everybody. Thank you. Really have two questions. One, And as a preamble, what's impressive about the panelists, all of you, is that you have very practical operational experiences. And just to pick on Tahara, for example, she has years of block and tackle in the policy world, translating that into the regulatory licensing world, has had her ear bent back countless times by industry in terms of improvement. So we've talked a bit about the benefits of the open, or at least as Dr. Kearns says, the more accessible data policies. I'm curious whether there are areas where the policies might in fact be impeding commercial solutions, and if so, where reforms might be best made. And that's one. And the other, to David Gauthier, is in terms of the commercial sector providing data to the IC intelligence community, I'm curious whether providing that is constrained in any way by the IC's own internal directives regarding analytical standards, or whether you and your colleagues are able to provide enough runway so that the private sector can provide the products without getting constrained, if you will, by those standards. So with that, I'll go on mute. Thank you, Nancy.
Okay, so but Courtney, before you go, the first question was
is to the panel as a whole. Basically, we see the benefits of the open data policy, if you will. Where is it impeding, and where could we have some useful reform? And then to David, and specifically,
about the IC community.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, so who would like to respond to the first part of that about the open data policy? Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, so I think it's, my biggest barriers from my seat at First Street right now really aren't the open data policies. They're related to, and we understand there's good reasons, and the business proprietary information that the U.S. government has, or for Privacy Act reasons, can't be shared. So I'll pick on FEMA, because we do flood, for example, right? So like the individual losses data and the actual fields behind the new risk rating 2.0 are not publicly available, right? Now, other agencies have found ways. I'm thinking of like the CIPSI agencies, the Social Security and Education and other census, that have found ways of sharing that data securely. So it is anonymized, it is secure, it is not publicly disclosed, but economic models can be trained on these data that are very valuable in the end applications. Just the economic model comes out, the original data do not come out of these kinds of situations. Some federal agencies have figured out how to do that, others have not. It is a big stumbling block to use those taxpayer resources that have paid for those data, to use them to the fullest extent, but also to respect the privacy laws that, of course, everybody has to follow. So it is tricky, but that's one of the obstacles that I run across every day.
Great. Does anyone else want to offer a response to that? As obstacles? Okay. So David, we're going to move then to the second part of Courtney's question about the IC community.
Yes, Courtney asked about compliance with IC analytic standards. And when we look at bringing commercial imagery or remote sensing data into our environment and providing that to IC analysts, we do the operational test and evaluation, which includes calibration and validation and fitness for use, so that there are rules for how that can be used in the analytic process. And so I think that's well understood. It does take some time and training of analysts and everything to properly cite and source their supply of data and information. But there's a new model brewing that we're embracing now, which is really asking the commercial industry to apply their technology innovations and their analytic prowess and maybe new algorithms to the data itself, and obviously, be able to cite how they do those things, and then give us a resulting information service or an information feed. And that is far easier for us to integrate into workflows and treat as a commercially available service, and use that in the analytic judgments of every day. So we like that model. We just have to do our due diligence on the front end to make sure that we understand what algorithms are being used and how they've been tested and trained over time, so that we can trust the resulting information according to our analytic standards and go with it.
Right. Well, thank you, David. And Sally, I apologize. Before I go to you, I skipped a question. And so if you don't mind, Sanjit had a question for Ed. Can you please help us get a better understanding of or understand another example of climate service when you were talking about weather service? So Sanjit, could you join us on camera for your question, please?
I apologize. I don't have access to a camera right now, but yeah, I
Okay.
just wanted to get a better understanding of an example of a climate service, because you give a great one of weather services that we could all relate to, but some of us are a little bit new to this field, and just help us kind of paint that picture in our mind of what a climate service could look like.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. One that you can go see today, if you go to realtor.com and you go look up an address, look up your house, look up a neighbor's house, you'll see on there both First Street's and the federal government's assessment of the risk for flood and or for fire for that property. And the First Street one is incorporating climate outlook for 30 years in that risk score. And so that's one example. So this is something that you're going to buy a house. Is this in a safe place? Well, is it a safe place now? Is it going to be a safe place in 30 years? Is it near the coast? And with climate change, it's going to increase my chances of storm surge. Is it in a valley in Appalachia, which is going to see heavier rainfalls, and it hasn't flooded in this valley in 30 years, but guess what? It's going to be flooding in that valley in another 10 to 15. Right? These are the kind of climate services that help you make that decision. Do I buy or not? And Realtor.com, Redfin.com, some of our other data partners are looking at, with their analytics on their platforms, is this climate information, is this climate service they're providing, is it helping their customers make informed decisions? Or do they see a change in the decision-making process because this information is available? It's a very interesting topic right now.
Yeah. And Sanjit, I would say that there are numerous companies that are providing climate services. And so as we think about what the NOAA weather service is like, I think you're going to see even more activity outside the government, where there are products being developed for specific audiences like real estate, as Ed has talked about, the financial markets, for a company called the Climate Service that was sold to Standard, was
S&P,
Standard, yeah. And another company with which, for full disclosure, with which I consult, is called Brisometer, and they're doing work in air quality readings, pollen readings, and they also do a fire tracker. But all of those are through a partnership with Apple. Those are available through your phone. So you're seeing more and more access for regular people like you and me, that we can access this kind of information, whether it's through Realtor.com or your phone or whatever. So there's an abundance of companies. It's really exciting. So let's go to Sally Frage now. Sally, are you with us on camera?
Yes, it'll just show a blue screen. I can do that if you want, but I'll just stay off camera if you don't mind.
Don't mind.
But unless you want to see a blue screen. But my question is about data, like you were just saying, how exciting it is of the industries and products and commerce that's built, as well as safety, like decisions on the environment and things like that. Very critical to have that data. What is the thinking for this group around some of the, I called it supply chain in quotes, air quotes. And my question of all the technology and infrastructure that goes ahead of that in launching the satellites, building the satellite spectrum policy, the government working with private sector. It takes a long time to get the spectrum for these kind of efforts. And then a very expensive asset goes up to space. And then we have a potential disruptor of space debris growing every day that could just disrupt the whole thing of all that very expensive investment, both in getting it into space, keeping it there, and getting the data out. Can anyone on the panel touch on the thinking of that? Over.
David, would you be the best person to talk about some redundancy in systems here, maybe?
Yeah, I'll start. So,
and the proliferation of systems.
Yeah, we definitely care about the supply chain, including all the parts that go into making a satellite. And then once it's collecting data on orbit, the information digits themselves being able to, get to the end user without being corrupted. And so that's some of the continuous evaluation we provide on some of these systems. In terms of proliferation, we're about to enter a golden age of small satellites. So, right now, my organization with 2 other agencies produces a semi-annual report on all the commercial remote sensing constellations in the world. And just yesterday, our June report came out, and we're now tracking 173 constellations of satellites that are either established or emerging around the world. And we're up around the 800 number for the number of remote sensing satellites on orbit. And we see that going to 5,000 or 6,000 by the end of the decade. So you see it on the news when SpaceX does a ride share and there's 80 or 90 satellites popping off. A lot of those are small satellites. I just talked to a great company called Orbital Sidekick. Their hyperspectral systems, their satellites are small. They only cost them, less than 10 million a piece. So they're not as expensive as they used to be. And they can proliferate large constellations so that, there's some redundancy in the information we get. I mentioned there were more than 10 US companies doing STAR. So there's redundancy. If one company goes out of business or someone has an on-orbit accident or a launch failure, there's now a lot of redundancy in the market. Yeah.
And Ed, you can probably talk to this point better than can I, but part of what's helped this rapid development of these new products, these climate services, is access to the historical data that exists within the federal government. And the fact that, cloud computing and artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of these things have allowed us to do better forecasting. And so as much as we look at new systems for new information, we are gleaming so much from the repository of data that we already have. And maybe you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the historical information is certainly really valuable. I, for one, as a scientist, a civil scientist, and now I've been waiting for years for U.S. publicly available, SAR data. So I'm really excited, David, to hear this latest news. But with the SAR data, the data rates for those satellites is so large, right? So you basically need to build a data center next to the receiving antennas, right? It's really hard to move that level of that volume of information around on our networks. Our networks are still lagging behind. So part of the concern with sort of the supply chain thing too is the ability to actually get to and analyze the data. So the scientists and the analytics has to go to where the data live, because the networks aren't good enough for these kind of high volume things. But we can do it, right? And so from somebody who started their career back like in 1990 in this work, we've come a long way. It's really exciting to see. But the ability of our technology to collect observations is just like with computer modeling, it's outstripping our ability to actually analyze this volume of information. So we're always chasing the ability to get through these volumes of information and the different types of information and combine them in really, really useful ways. There's the machine learning and AI that you mentioned, Nancy, has been a tremendous help in this massively scaled consumer grade compute capability that's out there right now in the cloud is opening doors to the uses of information that just wouldn't have been possible, even 5 years ago.
Right. And so thank you for adding to that. I think that is a really great point about the SAR data. Let's take one more question from our chat here. And Steve Harris, would you like to come on with your question that you talk about rhetoric the last 5 years and where is the change? How are we going to see change with the administrations here? Steve, are you there? Okay. Well then, Teresa Schwerin, my colleague at IGES, would you like to talk a little bit about your point about open science and NASA's move towards open science, which goes beyond open data?
Sure. Thanks, Nancy. So this builds on some of the earlier questions and comments. So we're seeing in the U.S. government push, particularly from NASA, for open science. It goes beyond data and data accessibility, but really making the entire scientific process open and transparent, including things like expanding the application of data and sciences and an outcome of that, what they're calling open source science. What do you see as to the panel as top priorities or things that could be done to make science more accessible to the private sector?
Who would like to address that? Go ahead, Ed.
Either I can speak from the private sector, and then happy to hear Dave and Tahara's view from the other side of the fence that I used to be on. Again, I'm practicing what I used to preach as a member of NOAA that also believed in open science. What NASA is doing right now with Shel Gentiman and others, pushing open science to a new level at NASA, I applaud that effort. I think it's fantastic. And now that I'm in the private sector, how do I, to your question, how do I use that data? Because I can go online, I can download the GitHub repo for a certain model. I can try to use it myself. But the real problem, the real barrier to the use of that science is to have a healthy relationship with the scientists within the federal government itself. And this is a problem because it doesn't scale like the kind of data systems we were just talking about. There's a limited number of federal scientists with this expertise, and everybody in the private sector wants to talk to them, wants to have a discussion with them about their product, about their science, so they can understand and use it. Because it's really hard just to read the papers and download the software and just take off and running. It's easier said than done. But when you can have a partnership, having the last 3 administrations have talked a lot about public-private partnerships. There's still I still struggle to find one that's based upon data and the value of data in this open kind of way that has been sustainably set up right now. But we're all still trying. But I think that's going to be the trick. Is going to be can we find a way where the access to this federal scientists, where they can help the public sector or the private sector, in an equitable kind of way, and also in a sustainable way, because that is the resource that's limited in this partnership. It's not the data, because that can be duplicated in scale. The observations, like I said, we got plenty of those, lots of compute power, but the expertise is the limited quantity that we're trying to figure out how to work with.
Great. So we are at 2:55, and I must ask our wonderful panelists here, are there any topics or any statements that you wanted to make that you didn't have an opportunity to do so? Is there anything that you'd like to add to these questions or conversations that we had before we turn it back over to Sally for wrapping up the session?
Well, I mean, I'll just say briefly, we're very excited to take in more requirements from not just federal civil government users, but the private sector. If you have a need to use data to create something that's important and it has both a commercial utility and a utility to the national security community, that's how we make a public-private partnership work. And so we're excited to do that with more and more data as it becomes available. And I think there are almost unlimited climate services that we could invent, over time with the population. It's not just, will it rain tomorrow or will there be a fire? There are so many different opportunities, and I'm reminded by the company Planet that intends to bring what they call planetary variables to the market, which is this idea that we can measure soil moisture, we can measure land surface temperatures, we can measure biomass and vegetation and deforestation, and having all that available to the community is just good for the science all around. Over.
Yeah. Any closing statement on your behalf, Tahara?
I'd like to, thank Washington Space Business Roundtable for having me here. You have my contact information, I think, is in the bio. So if anyone wants to reach out directly, that's fine. And that's pretty much it.
Great. Thank you, Tahara. And we look forward to great things from the National Space Council. Lastly, Ed, any further comment from you?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be part of this panel. It's been a great discussion. And one of the holy grails of climate change science and implication research right now is climate migration and the economic impacts that come from that. It kind of ties it all together, and it's on a global scale, not just a national scale. I think it's where we're all headed for. But with David's comments, Tahara's comments, I'm really excited about pursuing getting to those answers in a way that we can actually prepare as a nation and as a world for the change that's coming at us.
Well, thank you, all of you. I really appreciate all of your time and your insights. It's been wonderful. And Sally, back to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And what a wonderful discussion. And I'm apologizing to those of you that wrote questions that we weren't able to have enough time to get to. Nancy, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for moderating. And thank you also for asking a question, a STEM question, with regard to the growing of our future workforce. As you know, WSBR's charter is to promote education in the space and satellite technology area among young people in the Washington, DC area. So hopefully some of the areas that you've touched on today will be inspirational for folks that are interested in getting into those careers. So thank you also to the panelists. Thank you to Tahara, to David, and to Ed, and also to